Ottoman Science is a new speaker series co-sponsored by the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies, the program in History and Philosophy of Science, Stanford History Department, and the Middle Eastern Studies Forum. Each talk spotlights cutting-edge research on how scientific knowledge was practiced, taught, debated, and exchanged across the medieval, early modern, and modern Islamic or Islamic world, often through newly uncovered sources that change received narratives and reshape our understanding of science in Islamic societies. And Faiza, the architect of this small series, is a PhD student in the history of science. Her research focuses on the intersections between intellectual life of early modern Europe and the Islamic world. She's particularly interested in astronomy, cartography, cosmography, anti-urbanism, and other forms of early modern sciences. She's a member of the Oxford-sponsored research project titled Arabic Books and Astronomy in 17th Century Oxford, to digitize and curate Oriental manuscripts in astronomy in the Bodleian Library. She's also working with the Stanford's Calvin Institute for Practice, Astrophysics and Cosmography program. She's also the co-director of the Poetic Media Lab at the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, CESA. So,
Thank you so much for this introduction. So welcome everyone. This is, as Ali mentioned, our last event for the fall quarter. Today we are honored to welcome Dr. Nukhet Varlik, who is the foremost historian of science and medicine in the Ottoman Empire, with interest in disease, death, public health. Dr. Varlik is an associate professor of history at Crothers University. Her book, Plague and Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean World, the Ottoman Experience from 1347 to 1600, available here for purchase afterwards, published by Cambridge Press, received several prestigious awards, including the Middle East Studies Association Albert Haruni Book Award, the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association Fuad Kukrulu Book Prize, the Society of the Medieval Mediterranean's Dionysius Agius Prize, and the American Association for the History of Medicine's George Rosen Prize. And so these awards recognize the book and Dr. Varlik's significant contribution to the study of Ottoman Empire disease and public health. She also edited the volume Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean and was the co-editor of Death and Disease in the Medieval and Early Modern World, Perspectives from Across the Mediterranean and Beyond. And together with Dr. Ali Yuklu, she serves as the co-director of Stanford University Press's Ottoman World Series, Critical Studies in Empire, Nature, and Knowledge. And as many of you know, the books by our first two speakers for the Islamic Science series were published as part of this series. And most importantly, and hopefully she'll talk more about this, she is the principal investigator of a few very exciting interdisciplinary research and public history initiatives. One of them is Shifa'ana, which is dedicated to the study of death, disease, and healing, and Anatolia's longue durée history. So please join me in welcome Dr. Nukhet Varlik.
What I am hoping to do today, together, is an exercise for a new project I am working on. And in fact, I'll give you a little bit of a background how I ended up with this new monster that I'm trying to tackle. And this is a work in progress. And I am really looking forward to your questions, comments. Hopefully there will be good discussion here. So let me start with basically giving kind of a background for anyone who might not be more closely familiar with my work and history of medicine and disease and death in the Ottoman Empire, in particular the history of the early modern period, urban histories, or early modern Istanbul. I would like to say, well, at least my own adventure of how I ended up with what I'm going to talk to you about today is I'm finishing a book on the history of transformation of the Ottoman medical system from 1300 to 1600. 300 years, I thought, it's going to be a straightforward project. I'm just going to trace all the physicians, how they moved around the system, and look how the system goes. I already published a few articles about the project. I know exactly where it's going from, where it's going to, and thinking, all right, I got this. Then last January, I was a fellow at the NYU Abu Dhabi's writing program. And then I said, okay, well, yeah, the book is almost ready, but I think I need to add a background chapter about, what health was like, what kind of health problems were like the city was dealing with and all that, and that's where it really starts. And so the book is making this argument that, I hope it's okay if I move here, right? The book is basically like tracing the stories of an elite group of medical professionals, madrasa educated, Ottoman, Muslim, male professionals, about how they emerged as the dominant group in the medical scene and how gradually they eliminated other forms of traditional healers, women, mystic healers, and non-Muslims, how the process of evolution in elimination takes place by starting these rumors about them, like harming their reputation, etc., etc. So it's the process of professionalization and dominating the medical scene. So far, so good. And that's what I thought, it's a straightforward project. And so I thought, okay, if there is a change in the medical system, clearly, of course, it makes sense to trace the medical actors, look at what's happening and the state regulations, this and that. But then I started asking myself those questions, like, why is this happening during this time period, right? More specifically, I think the height of that transformation is anywhere between, let's say, 1550 to 1650, around that century, right? So things are changing. Okay, I think I have an explanation. I think, yeah, the Ottoman Empire is changing, the state administration is changing, times are changing. Might as well talk about change in the medical establishment structure. And we have previous scholarship that, in fact, you guys, listened to Tunchen's lecture recently. So there is definitely the sense in which you see formation of professionalization in different types of sciences, right? In various sciences and medicine. So it only makes sense to explain this professionalization as part of the larger trend in the urban fabric of society. Istanbul is growing and all that, and I'm going to talk about that. The state administration is changing. But then, the more I thought about this process of change, the more I realized, no, expansion of state power is not going to be enough to explain this. So at that point, I realized, actually, the historical reality it was corresponding to was also in the process of changing. In other words, the rise of a new group of medical professionals to dominate the medical scene may have been also a reflection of, and I'm not necessarily saying resulting from, though we can ask these questions, a reflection of, or was in parallel with, a larger change in the city in which people started to deal with new health problems. So if there are new health problems, and if people are suffering from new diseases, new forms of mortality, new forms of death, so maybe this new, That's new. You'll hear me say new a lot today, and I apologize for it. And I don't even know if it's that new. Maybe it's not. So these are some of the questions that I'm actually dealing with. What I believe that I see is new. What I call a new regime of death and disease. And again, I am really looking forward for feedback. If to see, let's test it out. Does the word regime is a good fit here or not? So okay. I am trying to make this argument that in the early modern period, especially starting, let's say, the second half of the 16th century onward, there is something new going on in Istanbul. And that historical reality, which I kind of name as new regime of death and disease, is maybe kind of what I need to deal with. And I went back to the book project, and I thought, it's just going to be the background chapter. I'll write about health problems in the city. And of course, I realized now it's just turning out to be more complicated than this background chapter. So let's see what's going to happen with this. And for many of you, this will be already familiar, but just to go over it very quickly, Istanbul, of course, is an ancient city. In fact, it goes back to the Neolithic period, its history, but Istanbul saw a huge transformation during the early modern period, right? The Ottoman conquest of the city, 1453, and quick building progress after that, infrastructure, and in other ways, you have massive changes taking place, not only in the rise of institutions, but also in terms of the number of people living in the city. The population of the city, in Istanbul, it grew about 10 times from the mid-15th to the mid-16th century. So we're talking about, expanding the number, the increase of the population 10 times. It already gives us, first of all, something to think about, right? It's not only expansion, but also more people. And with more people, of course, more problems. And in particular, of course, the problem that I am dealing with is the problem of death and disease, and how to put it all in context. So let me just very briefly summarize my argument. Starting in the early modern period, and this is not limited to Istanbul or the Ottoman Empire, and this is a global phenomenon. In the early modern period, you have new emerging diseases that become epidemic or pandemic. And I'm happy to go over some of the epidemiology terminology if there's, if you guys have any questions here. But, so first of all, new diseases spreading globally. Early modern period is an age of disease, new diseases, and we'll talk about what that means. At the same time, you have some older diseases becoming more virulent. So again, new types of virulence, new problems. And if we focus on Istanbul, in addition to, new diseases, older diseases that become more virulent and become epidemic, and new medical substances circulating, right? So that's why we have a global story, and Istanbul, of course, being a very strategically located city at the intersection of trade routes, and with the growing population, of course, was also a huge market for these medicinal substances that, were claimed to provide cure for these new diseases. And then, of course, the whole pharmaceutical knowledge and claims that go with it, and the marketplace. So moving from these new set of conditions, I am kind of leaning into making this argument, or making this argument that, is there something different going on here? And of course, once I will develop the case of Istanbul, then of course it makes more sense to kind of put it in perspective to look at global cities for comparison during that time period. But in addition to this, as I was trying to develop this argument, I also realized death in itself, not only disease, but death, either resulting from disease or from other causes, is also an important factor here for the public health of the population that I'm trying to understand. So, at what rate, for example, that people die? How many people died in Istanbul on a given day when there was an outbreak, or even just on a regular day? What did people die from? Like, today, for example, in the modern world, we have people dying more as a result of chronic diseases than infectious diseases, right? But of course, in the pre-modern period, this was not necessarily the same. But this does not mean that people did not die out of chronic conditions as well. How about accidents that resulted from this new crowded city, this new urban area, right? And other reasons that people died from, like, increased violence in the city, violent deaths that we have in archival records and whatnot. So in other words, I'm just trying to put these together and try to make the claim that what was going on during this time period was something unique that perhaps helps us explain or understand better how the medical system, not only the medical practitioner, but also medical knowledge itself, was in a process of change, right? So let's start the story here. And this, in fact, takes me back in my research, starting with my dissertation, and I was trying to understand death records in Istanbul during times of epidemics, during times of plague. I realized actually there was, you see the beginning of the emergence of public health, what we can call an early modern public health system, in which the number of individuals who died from plague was being counted at the city gates before the dead bodies were taken out of the gates of the city. We still don't know today anything that would be similar to what you have in London, for example, in the bills on mortality started in the late 17th century, right? It's not the same, but you still have at least this evidence that there was some record keeping going on. In fact, starting very early on, like the earliest evidence I found dates back to the late 15th, early 16th century, and then you have references in other sources that the counting idea was already fairly common by the end of the 16th century. So already this made me start thinking about the significance of death and how to manage death in an early modern city. Yes, at times of epidemics, of course, we have records that within the walled part of the city and in its, in Pera, the European side, or in Üsküdar, and the other parts of the city, the number of people dying every day during times of plague and when it was very heavy could be thousands of people. How did an early modern city deal with such massive number of people dying? And the sources insist that every single person was given the same death rights before burial, which means, according to Muslim custom, or at least for the Muslim population of the city, that the dead bodies were being washed, shrouded, funeral prayer at the mosque, and then being transported to the graveside and burial that followed. All of that required a certain level of management on the part of the administration, state administration, because the city did not even have burial grounds to accommodate such massive number of dead bodies. And just as a quick reminder, I don't know if anyone here would remember during COVID, remember some cities really had trouble managing dead bodies. Like in New York, there were horrible stories that some bodies were kept in refrigerated trucks for a while before burial. And of course, think about a society that did not have access to refrigeration, right? And in fact, in one truck, they had forgotten the refrigeration. So that was, I'm sorry to talk about just very gruesome image, but we're talking about the 21st century, New York, the most developed economy in the world. And so now going back to 15th century Istanbul, given the infrastructure, given the technology, that at least gives us an idea of how difficult management of dead bodies was during times of plague. In any case, so what we see in Istanbul is the beginning of the formation of the first communal graveyards. And this starts in the Waqf of Bayezid II. And basically, when you look at the city that you have going that, let me see if I can find that now, if not. Okay, let's skip it. Sorry. I should just, yeah. So the earliest maps in Istanbul start basically outside of the city walls, and then we have the formation of other cemeteries in the city. But so this challenge was obvious during times of plague, but later on, of course, in proportion to the growing population of the city, it became necessary to expand burial grounds. Starting early 16th century, we have the emergence of massive cemeteries, right, for Muslims, and separate graveyards for non-Muslim populations of the city. In fact, one of the projects I'm doing right now, it's called Necrogeographies of Istanbul. We are now working on creating digital maps of Istanbul cemeteries, and then looking at every marked grave, every single gravestone, to identify individuals buried in cemeteries, and hoping that will be a massive source for historians, cemetery as archive. So anyone interested, please feel free to follow our website and social media pages, and I'll talk about our research project in a little bit also. But so cemeteries, I've been interested. Again, that interest started with in the context of plague, but it's been with me for a while. In fact, I did write about the Ottoman administration's involvement in this entire process, and kind of played with the idea of necropolitics, early modern necropolitics. Going back to, well, this new regime of death and disease. So, in other words, it's not only that deaths are being kind of managed by the government, okay, that tells us part of the story, but now going back to the story of what were people dying from? How long did people live? Do we have a single estimate about what was the life expectancy at birth of an ordinary Ottoman subject in 16th century Istanbul, or early modern Istanbul? We don't have this information. How do we put together this story? Was life actually dangerous in Istanbul? In terms of, I mean, of course, we know that the city had a lot to offer, right? You could you would have access to the best merchandise in the world, the best architecture, the most talented people and wealth, and that only was something to be enjoyed for the elite, right? So we don't really have a lot of material evidence about, for example, the housing conditions, the conditions of the streets, or what kind of healthcare people have access to, even though we have some narrative accounts about the hospitals. But in day-to-day reality, how dangerous Istanbul was, we don't really know much about that story. So what I am trying to do is basically put together these like different parts of this this new dangerous world and try to make an argument about this new regime, and I'll get to the use of the term regime in just a minute. So more people dying, okay, new cemeteries being opened, and overall mortality is high, right? In fact, when you look at early modern cities, late medieval and early modern cities, mortality was more or less stable. For example, in a city, for like every 1,000 people, if you had like 30 deaths for every 1,000, that would have been average, right? But during times of plague or other epidemics, that number could increase, right? So what I'm looking for, I mean, will I be able to find that magic number, for example, for like 16th, 17th century Istanbul? It was a violent city too. I mean, not only Istanbul itself, like at least research already, showing this, there was a lot of violence, right? Political or otherwise. But we have other sources for this. Like this number, I believe, was, higher than other cities. I think Istanbul was a dangerous place to live, of course, for the non-elite. And of course, the city just kept receiving immigrants. And these immigrants would come to the city, and at least during times of epidemics, we know that, there is high mortality, and then there is more demand for jobs, wages increase. Shirket's work actually shows this. And then there is incentive for more people to move into the city. And then they die, and more, just, a cycle of disposable bodies in the city. And I believe that also tells us a lot about like, the shorter life expectancy. Again, if you just want to look at the global numbers, and nobody actually has the real number, we don't know. But the general consensus is that before 1800s, globally, we have this, what is called life expectancy at birth, no more than 35 years. This does not mean that people don't live past age 35. Life expectancy at birth also factors in child mortality, which was at least 20% before the modern period, if not more. Like 1 out of 5 children would not make it to adulthood. And of course, women, pregnancy and giving birth could be dangerous health situations. But let's also add to this natural disasters in the city. This one is actually showing, I think, maybe Patricia can help me if I don't remember this. I think this is just before the just after the 1509 earthquake, with is it Fatih Mosque or no, like even in Fatih neighborhood, the minaret is absent. That's why I have this image, but I can't remember which mosque it is.
It's too small to be the coffee.
It's a small.
It's way too small, but I know this image, but I also can't remember.
Okay. So, you know, these architectural stories is important. I mean, you have massive earthquakes in the city and fires. Fires of Istanbul during the early modern period was just notorious. In fact, you have some foreign visitors to the city saying that Istanbul is like, you know, fires and plagues. And also they say, watch out for dragons. So, dangerous? I don't know. So there was, so that also, that the city was expensive. You know, all of these, I mean, like, you know, that people have easy access to, like, you know, healthy food, and were they able to afford this? And in fact, like, we have the city, the central administration of the empire is really concerned about, for example, the issue of provisioning the city bread, for example. It was a huge deal that there was enough grains coming to the city and that bakers could have bread, and how much bread weighed, whether the bread sellers were like cheating, etc., etc. I mean, same problem with meat, that there was enough provisioning in the city and other things. But we know that, you know, during times of these big natural disasters, the provisioning of the city also could become a problem, right? In addition to, again, not to bore you with this, like, you know, delightful subject of death and disease, flooding is something that we have evidence for in the city, that some being catastrophic. And even if we don't look at those catastrophic moments, we can still question like health in the indexes, or like how we can think about the quality of life and health in the sense that the people have access to clean water, right? Or other environmental issues that affect human health. In any case, so these are some of the kind of like parts of the question that I am working on, but generally speaking, of course, you know, I think we have information about death, but sources won't tell us about, you know, mortality rates or anything like that. Yet in science, in art and literature, it is sometimes possible to find allusions to scenes of death, and that also gives us the emotional kind of context for this. Again, mostly from the elite, but in a way, I mean, my colleague here, as a historian of early modern empire, I believe will agree that death was everywhere. Yet, as a topic of research, death is in research, right? And even when you look at, even when you look at the burial grounds, the project that I am now dealing with, some cemeteries survived, but others completely disappeared, right? So there is, of course, some scholarship on this topic, but what you have mostly is about discussing the inscriptions of the tomb inscriptions of mostly like prominent individuals. But as valuable as that is, how can we go beyond this to recover the erased stories of individuals after they die? In fact, some, I mean, like pockets of these cemeteries survive in the city still, but large areas of burial grounds have been completely destroyed during the period of modernization of the city. You know, in Galata, in Pera, and also those that surround the city walls. There's not even trace of it today. Where are all these bodies? And who were they? How many people were there? I mean, allegedly, if the city's living population kept increasing, that also meant that the dead population would also increase, right? Okay. In fact, I have an image here. Okay, here. We actually see the beginning of burial areas in different parts of the city. This is, I believe, was made in the 1530s. You see already how the new cemeteries starting in just outside the walls of Galata, right? And the same you see surrounded that region. And of course, over time, it grew so much that it covered like what was called the Commercial Mall. It's like a huge cemetery, and you have depictions of it in visual sources. And in fact, one of the favorite kind of images of mine, and I also used for the book cover, it probably as close as we can get to a scene of burial in an Ottoman city. This one comes from Encina. And again, what is interesting, you see that like the cemetery itself is in the process of formation. It's growing, just scattered graves, but outside the city. Again, this was like what I'm talking about in the case of Istanbul. Cemeteries starting outside the city walls apparently was not an exception. In fact, when you look at European history, urban history, the argument that cemeteries as being, places for burial outside the city, walls or outside the cities, as being part of the modern urban history. Is usually you have examples about Paris, London, and American cities as being kind of the leader of this movement or this new thing. Whereas in Istanbul already, this was a challenge that was being addressed in this way much earlier. Okay. No, Patricia, this was the image.
Yes.
For,
yeah. Okay.
okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
All right. So let me move a little bit to how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5. Okay.
We need to do Q&A.
Okay. So so far, I just tried to give you a context about how the health situation in the city was changing. And the thing that I want to spend a few minutes talking on is like the introduction of new substances to the city. And it's not only new substances, but also new types of animals. This is an image that I recently discovered. There's, I hope you can see the monkey here. A monkey is being kept as pet animals in Ottoman elite households. It's just, of course, an example, but as like immigrant populations we're talking about, like people moving to the city, it wasn't only people. You have new animals, new plants, and new medicinal substances, and also like new chemical substances, right? It's a city that is growing with its own demands, new types of food. I mean, think about coffee. how important that became for not only the history of Istanbul, but the beginning of coffee shops, and it's something in the modern world we're still enjoying as part of that tradition. Same can be said about tobacco, opium, or other substances, new substances coming to the city during the early modern period. But if we want to focus more closely on medicinal substances, then we also realize that, well, these medicinal substances were being sold for a reason, because they were claiming to treat these new diseases, new health conditions. So, again, there's a lot we can say on animals, but I will have to skip all that and then talk a little bit about these new medicinal substances. Well, we have many of these. Suddenly, in the 16th century, you start hearing the names of some new medicines. Again, this is the era of the Columbian exchange, and so tropical medicines are circulating globally, and some of these new tropical substances were treated as like the magic of that time. Oh, this treats this, it treats all diseases, etc., etc. I did a case study on one called Tropicini, as the sources go, but also in Persian sources. In Persian, still today being used in Ayurvedic medicine as far as I've noticed, especially for anti-inflammatory benefits. Suddenly, in court records, I see cases about Tropicini. Someone blaming the other that, so someone sells a Tropicini and then the other says, oh, I had side effects, that's not good. Or, the guy sold me, but the dosage was wrong, or the pharmacist gave me the wrong. So there's a mess. I mean, of course, with older medications, when there is an established knowledge, lived knowledge of how to use a certain medication and what to expect, or the dosage, things were okay. But when new medications come into place, I mean, now think about the hype about Ozempic. I know I'm kind of giving these like completely anachronistic examples, but at the same time, when something is new, you don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. So, same can be said about Palo Santo, and this is a new article that my student, Tunahan Dumas, is finishing his PhD at the European University Institute in Florence, about Palo Santo, how it became this new thing called Mübarek Ağaç, the blessed tree in Ottoman sources, and because it was marketed as a cure for syphilis. Syphilis was on the rise. It was not a pleasant life. Syphilis was on the rise. Plague was a constant presence. And smallpox returned in the 17th century as a very virulent disease. And add to the mix other health conditions and other dangers of living in the city, and of course the health disparities. We don't talk much about it, but not everyone has access to equal public health privileges. So especially for the ones whose stories of death and disease have been erased to the modern period. So our research project and public history project, Shifana, Histories of Death and Disease, is dealing with these questions. Thank you for your patience. A very gruesome topic.
I was wondering about two things. So the first one is just the numbers. You mentioned 30 people per 1,000 a day. That's your estimate?
Well, first of all, we don't have any numbers. That is something that you have, for instance, have evidence for in late medieval and early modern Italian cities, where there's better documentation. So it does not represent Istanbul, and sorry if I was not clear about that. But again, what is that magic number for Istanbul? on like regular times, for example. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
But do you mean per day?
Per every 1,000 person, if you have, it wasn't interest well, okay? Well, did I answer your question or, yeah?
Yeah, sorry. It's just, it's a whole lot of people. You know, if Istanbul had 1 million people, then
Yeah.
3% a day, that would be like 30,000 people a day. So the city would disappear.
There are outbreaks where sources tell us that 2,000 died per day. 2,000 people died per day, for example, for like a month. So I have this one source from 1562. He says he's the Habsburg ambassador. When there is a plague in the city, he goes to Büyükada, and then daily he receives news from the city. He's asking, "Is plague? How is plague going? Is it like abating?" And they said, finally, it's now under control. It's decreasing. It's soon going to end. Only 600 people a day dying now. When it was 600 a day, it means that it's like it's done with, right? When it's more than 1,000 a day, or even more, we have like some others where like 3,000 people dying a day. Just think about the physical burden of opening new graves and carrying and washing and like shrouding, finding like even coffins, building coffins, like the labor and the material components related to that. That's a lot of dead bodies, yeah.
Thanks so much for this excellent presentation. I'm studying a text from 1514. This is written by a merchant from the city of Ganje. He was actually traveling between Tabriz and Istanbul, and there are several references, numerous references to a plague island in Istanbul. I don't know if you have ever seen such a reference in sources. He calls it Jazire Tawun. And there are numerous references. For example, he says that Mehmet II resided there. So it was interesting because I was trying to locate this island.
Okay, I haven't seen that reference, and I haven't seen, it's not a real island, I think. I think because Mehmet used to go to Edirne or some other places when plague happened. There are certain parts of the city where people took refuge to during times of plague, and one of them was Büyükada, the island itself, like Prince's Islands. But I think Mehmet did not go there. That I know. There also are villages. What we call today the Belgrade forest area, because there is this village called Belgradcık in the like kind of north of Istanbul. So you have some villages or other places that sources specifically mention as kind of designated summer residences that people go to during times of plague. In fact, when you look at the development of waterfront properties in Istanbul, small fishermen's villages along the Bosphorus, even those were preferred by European diplomats and other state officials or merchants as a place they preferred to stay during times of plague. And again, during plague, during COVID, a lot of people moved to their summer residences if they could afford it, right? That was typical everywhere. So in Istanbul, when you look at the development of the summer residence, that actually is very closely connected to. But I'd be interested in seeing the source if you'd like to share later. Thank you. I don't think that was an island though.
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting though, very interesting. Never heard of it.
Thank you for that really super interesting lecture, and congratulations on the book. And I have a question that's sort of a methodological question about sources, because I noticed you have archival sources that are obviously internally generated, well not obviously, but that seem to be internally generated, and then you have these totally magnificent images that I wish we could have spent a whole lecture on each of those images. And then you have, and it seems to me like you have the kind of printed primary sources. There's a whole category of printed primary sources that are outside in views like French, German, Dutch. And so I'm just curious, how do you, I imagine there are kind of different ways of looking at death and at, in general, at kind of life in Istanbul from the outside and from the inside. So how do you navigate that?
So first of all, thank you for the question. In terms of sources, will it be a really shortcut if I say everything? Everything, all kinds of sources that I can get my hands on, including Ottoman archival and narrative sources and chronicles and medical sources. Even architecture is sometimes helpful, in addition to European, travelers' accounts, diplomats. So there is a lot in terms of textual sources. But I am also experimenting with the idea of non-textual sources and how it can help here with this project. I mean, I did not enough time to go into this, but I am now doing this collaborative project in Iznik, the ancient city of Nicaea, not too far away from Istanbul, working with a group of archaeologists. They finished excavating the Roman theater there, and we realized just outside the theater area there was a necropolis area. Very irregular burials, so you have bones piling up. I actually went and saw the bones there, and they retrieved some of those individuals. Now we have about 200 in our lab, but there is more that needs to be recovered. So something like that, I think, okay, it's not Istanbul, but it can give us an idea of, if we can identify that with the carbon dating, we can find out when they died, right? With isotope testing, actually we're working on 2 individuals because we identified, we think that we identified evidence of plague into 2 of these individuals. Where they came from, we can do isotope analysis for their teeth. We're retrieving ancient DNA, pathogenic DNA from, again, teeth and bones. And so you at least know where they came from, what they ate, how their diet was, evidence of trauma or lesions on the bones showing, malnutrition, trauma or hard work. I mean, the 2 individuals that we have evidence for that died of plague, and now we're trying to get more. So, for example, one was male and the other was female. The female probably died between the ages of 18 to 25. And the male between 25 to 35. They died very young. They immigrated from somewhere to Iznik, and the genetic analysis shows that they died in 1380. Who were these people? That's the limit of my kind of methodology as a historian. What can I say more? Nothing. You don't have a textual source. You just have the bones, right? And you make do what you can do. So now we identified that they both immigrated from somewhere, the same place, and now we're doing this project of creating an isotope map of Anatolia so we can match them with their location of origin, and that they probably, if they died in the same year, and if they came from the same place, they probably knew each other. So mitochondrial analysis can give us an idea of whether they were related, for example. And to make it even worse, and I know that this has been very dramatic here, the female skeleton, we also found fetus bones. So she was probably pregnant. And it's clear that they work very hard, physical labor, because the bones also show that trauma and malnutrition. So just think about the lives of the individuals we're researching. To me, until I physically saw the bones, it was easy to talk about plague, this and that, in the written sources. But when you physically see the bones of the historical actors that you work on, that just makes it, Anyway, the answer is, I think, yes, written sources, absolutely, going to be very helpful. But even going beyond that, using bones as an archive, or for that matter, the cemetery project can also help us with mortality, with demographic profile of individuals buried in a single cemetery, for example. So yeah, I'm kind of advocating going beyond written sources, textual sources.
I saw in a couple of instances, a couple of rides after rides, we know that bodies were dropped in Bosphorus, and there are tons of bodies, and I think they put some stone, that has some stone or something, so that they can.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, obviously you cannot perform, I don't know, ritual. Maybe, I don't know, but do you have cases that see the Bosphorus or Marmara Sea was used as a massacre?
I mean, as far as I know, I haven't heard of any research of like recovered bodies. But you're right. I mean, there is a lot of like not only violence but also violence on the body, right? And in fact, I worked on collecting some evidence on like the bodily mutilations. Some maybe before as torture, but some after death. So just chopped off heads. Heads being crushed by elephants. I mean, we have all the some visual sources and all descriptive accounts, and people, whose heads were buried somewhere else and the body is somewhere else. So a lot of violence on the body. And so the idea is that the death rites, would be required for anyone for kind of reuniting with the soul at the time of resurrection. That's kind of the ideology or the theological framework to understand this. But also the fact that there was a marked grave for everyone was seen as a right, like human right kind of thing, death right, right? So anyone who was denied of a marked grave, like Ibrahim Bashar, or like many of the political actors that fell from favor, not having a marked grave was, the biggest punishment, eternal punishment. So, but yeah, it will be fascinating to see if there is any research on. To my knowledge, there isn't.
I have a question. It's very interesting for me, for pre-early scholars, how you get to information and how frustrating it must be to try to get those numbers. And you said you don't have any numbers, but you also said Habsburg ambassador, like he wrote about the 600. If the state was not keeping a track of these bodies, who was and who was transforming this information to the ambassador to the island?
Great question. And in fact, I wrote about this. So I believe there was regular record keeping. Today, we don't have those collections. So maybe one day we'll find them. Maybe they'll be destroyed, so we don't know. But there is evidence that the record keeping was being done. That, so far, we know. But in addition to the formal authority of the states, like writing down the numbers, there were other ways that people could calculate the daily death toll. For example, one of them was about bread consumption. So they basically could calculate, and even foreign travelers talk about this. Like normally, they produce like this number of bread every day. If it is like if it declined by a certain percentage, because like everybody ate bread, right? So that would be an indication of it. Also, I talk about this in the book, just saying kind of lived knowledge of epidemiology. Like, again, I'll give the super anachronistic example of COVID. Even COVID, there was like official numbers. Yet at the same time, if you always heard from friends and family everywhere this person getting there, so you know that the numbers are increasing, even if you don't have the statistics. You have that lived knowledge of an epidemic, right? So, but what I was really referring to, so we're better informed about the death tolls during times of plague. What I'm really frustrated about, what in like regular times, when there's no plague. It's like when there's something extraordinary, you will have at least more evidence about that thing, right? Because it's exceptional. What about just regular times? How, like, what is that baseline? So that, again, I don't know how we're going to do that, but it will be fascinating to know about it.
Just the last question.
Yeah, hello. I mean, there's been a lot of doom and gloom because we're talking a lot about death, but I want to ask about the silver linings. From a sort of Malthusian perspective, if a lot of people die suddenly, that means you have higher wages for people. That means you still need to hire as many people to work the palaces and the docks and sort of run the empire, but you have less people to work, and so for that temporary period until maybe population readjusts, you have less mouths to feed, and you have to sort of pay them more to get that job to be done. So is there any evidence in what you've been observing about this?
Yeah, I mean, economic historians have long worked on that question, and in the case of the Ottoman example or the modern period, we have research and it's been published, and Şevket Pamuk is a very important economic historian, wrote about this as well as other historians. So we know more about that cycle, how plague comes, how many it kills, and how it affects the wages and what happens. So what I am more focused on is to see the impact, not in terms of price range and all that, but as this kind of like continued effect and strain in the form of like what is called not only disease burden but kind of death burden, like the existing urban population. How to deal with it. We're not even talking about the emotional component of it, just even looking at the more kind of like the rudimentary level of understanding, where the bodies were being sent to, what was happening, who was burying them, etc., which already is kind of, the most basic level of understanding what was going on. We have not even started exploring about like the emotional impact of death. What do you do when, and this is typical for the early modern period, more than one individual dying if there is an epidemic. More like families losing several children in one epidemic, for example. And that reminds me of the diary of a 17th century Sufi dervish in Istanbul, Sayyid Hassan. He wrote a diary during an outbreak of plague, and he lost, I think, 2 or 3 of his children, and his wife, and his best friend. And how did people deal with it? We were like, there is a lot to explore. I mean, yeah.
Great, but thank you so much.